Good morning. So I'd like to thank Alicia, Jeff, and the rest of the RRC team for inviting me to be here today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Joanne and Kaylin, who are in the audience today, for doing the research on this project and for putting together this presentation. I have two disclaimers. One is I am not an academic or a researcher, so one might wonder why I was invited here. And as scary as the equations were for you, Jeff, just think about the impact on me. So that's one disclaimer. The other is that we put this presentation together based on the draft of the paper, where you had 4 different options. So my presentation is going to cover all 4. So let's start there. So what I was asked to do was look at not just the public policy implications of Jeff's research, but also the political feasibility. So I think, Jeff, I found your paper fascinating, and I thought the conclusions were really interesting in terms of possible behaviors in response to different changes, as well as consumption patterns. So what we tried to do here to sort of bring in some real life possibilities. And so what we did is we looked at different aspects of what happens in the real world, which is we looked at survey data over time of what people say they will do in response, or what changes are acceptable to them. But we also looked at voting patterns over time. So that's what I'm going to cover today. First, just to review the 4 different kinds of changes that were in the draft paper and who they mostly have impacts on. So first is the COLA adjustment. And for that adjustment, mostly that's going to have an impact on people who tend to live longer. And those are going to be more highly educated, higher income individuals for the most part. The opposite effect happens when you raise the full retirement age, as Jeff was saying. So those people who are going to be most affected by that are people who retire early and who don't have as long a life expectancy, so low-income individuals and minorities. Payroll taxes, if you increase those, they tend to affect everybody across the board in terms of all demographic groups. The tax cap, which is something that Jeff didn't cover here today, tends to impact high-income individuals for the most part. So what we looked at first, which we found really, really interesting, is voting patterns. And we looked at it from a number of different demographic perspectives. And the first perspective was how people vote according to income. So this graph shows basically that low-income people, people who earn less than $50,000 a year, even though they are a larger share of the population, they are twice as likely not to vote as people who earn $75,000 or more. So from a political point of view, one could argue that any changes that affect that demographic may have less of an impact from a political point of view. So that was one aspect that we looked at in terms of voting patterns. On this slide, you can see another thing that we looked at was age and the impact of age and ideology on voting patterns. So in terms of the age, younger people make up the largest share, those that would be most affected by the Social Security Trust Fund running out of money. They're the ones that are going to be most effective. They have the largest share of the vote, so you would think that they would have the greatest impact in terms of a voting pattern. But interestingly enough, from survey data, what we find is that across the ideological and demographic spectrum, whether you're Republican, a Democrat, high income, low income, whatever your age is, people all seem to say, even if this change affects me, I still think in order to save the system that we should do it. And so here you see that 74% of Republicans feel that raising Social Security taxes, even though it's going to have the greatest impact on them potentially, they're in favor of it. So what do we suggest? Taking together Jeff's research in terms of the behavioral response to it, as well as all of these other aspects of voting and what people say. So I guess we would propose a solution that's two parts. The first is to either raise or eliminate the tax cap. And interestingly enough, even though in any given year that only affects 6% of the population, over the course of one's working lifetime, 20% of the population will hit that tax cap. And so we think that that could clearly be one of the parts of the solution, obviously has a greater impact on high-income individuals. At the same time, we think that raising the retirement age also should be considered in here. And from a political point of view, even though it impacts people who are in lower income, they tend to vote less, so the political backlash may be less as a result. And then finally, sort of, is this feasible? Is this possible to actually do this? And we do think it is possible. Back in 1983, the last time that they raised the retirement age and made changes to the Social Security program, they raised the FICA limit to be at the 90% income limit. And that, because of increasing wages over time, even though the FICA tax cap has gone up every year, it hasn't kept up with wages, and so now it's only at about 83%. And again, I think this is something that across the demographic spectrum, people support this, so I think it's something that could happen. And then with regard to raising the retirement age, a national poll found that basically, once people were educated about the different impacts and heard arguments on both sides of raising the retirement age, that basically 8 out of 10 people did support raising the retirement age to 68. This was taken a few years ago. So again, I think you have to sort of layer in all of the different aspects, the behavioral aspects, as well as what people say they can work with. And I think those are some things to just consider going forward as you do your research. So I'm way ahead of time.
Thank you, Melissa.